Welcome to the fourth episode of JEC Interviews, where we connect with leaders in business, economics, and finance to gain valuable insights from their experiences. My name is Kasiram, an economist writer here at Junior Economics Club of Mississauga, and today I'm joined with my colleague Mia, also an economist writer. Well, Mia.
Oh, sorry. Hello, and today we are honored to welcome Mr. Boutros. Mr. Boutros is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on household financial decision making and macroeconomy. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto and a master's degree and PhD from Duke University, all in economics. Mr. Boutros, it's a pleasure to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
That's great to hear. We're thrilled to have you here. Let's dive right into our first question. Okay. What inspired you to pursue a career in economics, and how did your time at the Bank of Canada influence your research on household finance and macroeconomics?
Sure. Even when I was in high school, I always kind of knew that I wanted to do something more on the math or business side. So I had applied to universities in the 12th grade, and I got into a double degree math and business in Waterloo Laurier. And then I took an econ course in the last semester of high school, and I really liked it. And I thought, okay, I can probably do some economics when I get to my business degree. And then I took a few courses in econ during my first year of that double degree. I absolutely loved economics. I loved math, and I didn't really enjoy the business courses because the business courses, a lot of them were about managing a business. And I was actually much more interested in the economy as a whole, kind of understanding how different businesses interact. At the same time, I've always had this passion for policy, trying to understand, well, what are the things that organized government can do? What are the kinds of laws or regulations that can help? So I joined the Bank of Canada a couple of times, first as a research assistant, and then after graduating with my PhD as a senior economist. And there it's a lot of fun work to do research, but also make sure that you can apply that to policy. So I've always kind of known that I like economics. I like how it combines social science, human behavior with mathematics and rigorous data work. And then I wanted to use that to study the macroeconomy and kind of help make decisions for Canadian policymakers to help all of us here in Canada live better lives.
Okay, so speaking of the macroeconomics concepts, of these macroeconomics concepts, which ones do you think are most essential for students, especially those starting out in careers, to grasp like a broader perspective of macroeconomics?
Well, the good news and the bad news is that it's everything. So, if you're a trade economist working in Canada for the past 15, 20 years, there wasn't really much to do. We had pretty stable relationships with the United States, but as you guys know, a few months ago, all that kind of turned on its head. So nowadays, it's super relevant to learn more about trade economics. And if you're just starting out, then there's a lot to learn. But if it's something that you've been researching for the past 10, 15 years, well, now's your time to shine. So there's so many different fields of economics, and especially even within macroeconomics. And therefore, it's really nice to kind of pick a topic that you think is interesting. And then over the course of our lifetimes, over the business cycle and over kind of all these exogenous shocks, ranging from these trade policies to the COVID pandemic, there's always going to be a time when your specific field of macroeconomics or even economics more broadly is relevant. It might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but it's always good to have the answer ready when it's needed, as opposed to kind of scrambling and saying, oh, this is now relevant, let me work on it. Kind of those people who have been working on it for a long time, they're the ones who are saying, well, this is all kind of shocking and scary to you guys, but we know what we're talking about, including many of my colleagues here at the University of Toronto who are all over the news on CBC and even international mediums to talk about these tariffs and things like that.
Okay, got it. So on a related note, I wanted to ask you about your research on aggregate implications on household borrowing and consumption. So can you explain how these factors interact with broader economic conditions and why understanding this relationship is so crucial today?
Sure. So, what is the macroeconomy? Right? The macroeconomy is just all of us making decisions added up. And the thing is that when I or you or anyone watching this goes to the store to buy a can of soda, that individual transaction is not going to really have a big impact. But if all of a sudden we all decide we want to start buying soda, that's the aggregate impact of an increase in demand, which is going to raise prices. So my research tries to understand how households make decisions given the state of the macroeconomy. Then how does the macroeconomy respond all
Okay.
of the decisions by households, and then it goes over and over and over again, right? It's a cycle, and that's what we call equilibrium. Trying to understand the interplay between individual forces, how they translate to the macro forces, and then back to individuals, and so on, until we reach some kind of steady state equilibrium. So I focus in particular on consumer borrowing with credit cards and mortgages and so on. And there, the price is the interest rate, and the quantity is the amount of debt that people are taking on. So it's always been relevant in a country like Canada when we are very heavily indebted for good reason. But it's especially relevant as we think about things like monetary policy with interest rates going up and down.
Okay, that's a great point. It also connects with something else I wanted to talk about. So with the rise of tech and AI, how do you think that the future of household finance and personal consumption patterns will evolve, and what implications might it have for the economy as a whole?
So a little while ago, when I think none of us here were actually born, this new thing came out called spreadsheets. And everyone said, oh no, spreadsheets are going to make accountants redundant. You don't need to hire an accountant anymore. You have your fancy spreadsheet on your computer, and there goes that whole industry. What actually happened is that financial standards and financial reporting became much more complicated. Right now, it was feasible for you to have much more complicated financial statements, both in terms of reporting them and also in terms of consuming them. And then the people who were experts were no longer just plain old accountants, but accountants who could kind of use these new softwares to leverage these advances and kind of help people make more complicated financial pictures. So, in terms of personal finance, I think that's really where it's going to happen. Where nowadays we have a few mortgage choices, a few credit cards, a few kinds of student loans, and it's already a super hard problem for the average person to solve. But with all these AI tools, whether they're augmented by a human or not, what's really going to matter is how can we kind of design better financial products that AI can help us choose from. So I think the same way that spreadsheets didn't make the financial industry less, they actually made it much, much larger. These AI tools are going to do the same thing and make this personal finance industry much, much, much larger as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree that using the AI and spreadsheets for financial literacy is key. So, relating to that, I wanted to ask you, how can young people become more financially literate in a way that helps them both understand personal finance and its relationship with macroeconomics factors like inflation and interest rates?
Well, the answer is an easy one that you're not going to want to hear, but it's reading and studying. So it's really, really important that, at this stage in your lives, you guys are building tools, right? You need to kind of understand the terminology, the formulae used, kind of the algebra behind these things. And that just boils down to sitting down and thinking carefully about these problems. At the same time, when it comes to my job in terms of research, what we do is come up with not answers, but questions. So it's really important to stay curious about the world if you want to be a researcher. What that means is reading both kind of economics articles all the way to economic articles in magazines like The Economist, but even just the news, right? The number one place where research ideas actually comes up is by looking around at the world and saying, I wonder how that works. And economics is just a very structured and disciplined way for thinking about all kinds of phenomena that are going in the entire world. So I would say learn the tools, stay curious, understand how the world works, and ask yourself, what do I find interesting? What do I want to do? What do I want to study?
Okay, I appreciate your insight on financial literacy. So I'd also love to hear your thoughts about piggybacking back on like your experience at in the Bank of Canada. I wanted to ask you like any like common misconceptions like did you like encounter there when you were working there? So
Sure. So, for those who don't know, right, there's really two broad forms of macroeconomic policy. The first is fiscal policy, which is related to government spending, which is what they spend, and then government taxes, which is a form of government income. So, that's not what the Bank of Canada does. That's what the federal government does by our elected representatives. Now, the Bank of Canada is the other form of macro policy, which is monetary policy. It's about controlling the supply of money, which is a weird thing to think about, but it's about controlling the interest rate and kind of the price level. We all know that a carton of eggs today costs more than it did 5 years ago, but it's the same amount of eggs. So monetary policy is about controlling that price level, and the Bank of Canada's goal, which they're very, very good at, is keeping the growth rate of money at about 2%. That is ultimately their goal. And the tool that they have, really the primary thing that they can do is control one interest rate that very, very kind of surprisingly is actually never transacted at. They just control one interest rate that the banks can transact at. And then there's this really interesting pass-through phenomenon to all the other interest rates in the economy. So the bank is really focused on inflation, understanding that price level growth rate, and what they should do with the interest rate. When you work at the Bank of Canada, you're part of a very, very large team that tries to understand what is happening with the price level and what should the Bank of Canada do to counteract those natural forces to keep the price level growing at a steady 2%. So the Bank of Canada has really very little banking in the sense of day-to-day activities. There's no checking accounts, there's no borrowing accounts, nothing. The Bank of Canada is really focused on understanding inflation and using the interest rate to control inflation. And I know it was a painful period after the pandemic. Maybe you guys are not as involved in the economy yet, so you don't realize it. It's a very, very painful period, but the Bank of Canada, along with banks around the world, actually did a very, very good job in kind of counteracting this massive, massive COVID shock to help us kind of come out of it relatively unscathed. But that would say is the big misconception that the bank doesn't transact like a normal bank. And the bank actually did a very good job, including the Federal Reserve Bank in the US and all the central banks around the world, in helping weather the global economy through this pandemic shock.
So
Yeah,
I'm
I
so
hadn't
sorry to
really
interrupt
thought
you.
of
Are you still able to see my camera?
it's a black screen, like an on
All right.
mine.
I'm just gonna rejoin because it seems I'm having some technical
Sure.
difficulties.
Okay, got it. So yeah. So thanks for the insightful advice on that topic. So I had one more question about this, and then I was gonna pass it on to Mia. So I wanted to talk about how like household decisions and borrowing and consumption play a role in shaping the broader economic policy, and what can young people do to be more informed about these like dynamics?
Sure. So in terms of the second question, I think just being aware of what does it mean to borrow? What does it mean to transact? I think sometimes we might have this idea that borrowing is either always good or borrowing is either always bad. So when you get a mortgage, for example, you're borrowing a lot of money to buy a house. That seems like a good thing. When you get an auto loan, you're borrowing a lot of money to buy a car. That seems like a good thing. But even your credit card, if you decide to borrow on your credit card, which is a relatively high interest rate, but it's for a good reason, then it's a good thing to do. And there's a lot of people who are kind of either they borrow all the time without thinking it through, or people who are completely averse to borrowing and they don't ever borrow. And the truth is somewhere in between there. That's kind of the important thing to do. Now, how does that interact with the macroeconomy? Like I was saying, for example, the central bank, they're only concerned with inflation. Let's say that there's a lot of spending in the economy and people are borrowing a lot of money to spend. Now, when they're spending a lot, they're inflating prices a little bit more than the Bank of Canada wants. What the central bank will do is they'll raise interest rates, and that's going to make people borrow less because now the cost of borrowing has gone up, and that's going to make spending go down, and that's going to make the price level grow at a more constant rate. And we might think, oh, that's a weird thing. Why should the government want people not to borrow? Why would they want the economy not to grow? And the key is that you want to grow at a steady, sustainable rate. There's been lots of examples in history around the world where governments let their economies grow way too fast and it came crashing down. And it's kind of this old adage that slow and steady wins the race. It's the same thing. We want to make sure that we're growing at a steady rate, a constant rate. It helps people plan for the future. It helps kind of infrastructure develop properly. It just kind of what a lot of economic theory has dictated is the right thing to do. And that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, that makes sense. So thank you for the insightful advice so far. I'll now pass it over to my colleague Mia to continue with the next part of the interview.
Sure.
Thank you, Cassiran. I really appreciate all the valuable insights so far, Mr.
Hmm.
Bouchos. Moving on to the next topic. As an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, how do you tailor your teaching to help students better understand the economic challenges they face, especially those transitioning from school to work?
Sure. So let me talk a little bit about what an assistant professor does. So first of all, just so we're all on the same page, um, my job is to be a professor, and then there are different ranks of professors. So if you just say professor, that's a full professor, and then there's an associate professor, and there's an assistant professor. So all three of these are professors, and they're just different kind of ranks of seniority. Now, especially as a relatively junior member, I'm still developing my courses. So my goal when I teach is to help students do two things, very similar to what I described before. Number one, equip them with tools. We need to have the tools in our toolkit so that we can apply different economic concepts to different ideas out in the world. And the second thing is to help them grow curious. So I always try to assign projects that will force students to not just take the textbook material and say, oh, I know that, but to apply the tools they've learned to the real world. The other thing a professor does, and this is really the majority of our time, is research. But there's nice interactions between research and teaching. When you're teaching something to relatively young students, it forces you to really understand it. As I'm sure you guys can relate, it's really hard to explain something clearly if you yourself don't know it. So there's this nice kind of interplay between making sure that I understand the material so I can teach it to my students, and my students will also kind of teach me about the best way to teach them. And that informs my research, that informs how I present my research. So there's this really nice kind of connection between teaching and research. And if you're at the Bank of Canada, for example, you don't do any teaching. Instead of doing research and teaching as would a professor, you do research and policy work. But it's really always about research and then trying to connect that to either helping your students learn more about the world and equipping them with tools to go out into the world. Or if you're at the bank, it's a little bit more advanced and you're trying to use your research to help make policy decisions.
That's a really great perspective. Building on that, many students come to university without a strong background in finance. How do you equip them with the tools they need to make informed decisions about managing debt, building credit, and saving for the future?
Sure. So a big part of it has to happen in high school for sure, learning about these things. But the problem is when you teach students about debt or other personal finance in high school, most high school students just simply don't have that much income yet, right? You guys are still young, you guys are still learning how to navigate education, becoming young adults, and so on. So that's why teaching personal finance at the high school level is very, very promising, but it's a little bit early, in my opinion. So I'm actually teaching a course in household finance at the University of Toronto starting from next year, and other universities also have these kinds of courses. But the good news is that today you can go on YouTube and learn so many great things. Personal finance is a really, really interesting field because there's no one size fits all solution. Sure, there are some general concepts that apply to most people, but overall, there's so much leeway. You might have one financial plan that makes perfect sense for you, and another financial plan that's completely different that also makes perfect sense for you. And it depends on your preferences, how risk averse you are, for example. It depends on your goals. Do you plan on needing a lot of money in the near future for a vacation, to get married, to have kids, or not? All these kinds of things. So a lot of it is really out there for you to learn. And university just provides a kind of a structured way to do that. But if you're into this kind of thing, there's a lot of material out there right now for you to immediately learn about this stuff.
Right. That's really insightful. Now, shifting gears a little bit, I was wondering, housing costs and student loans are some of the biggest financial pressures that young people face. What advice would you give your students about managing these burdens while still planning for the long-term financial health?
Sure. So I would say at this point, it's about educating yourself. You're still a little bit young to be too caught up in, I want to buy my first house. At this point, it's really about focusing on your studies, your education, and making sure that you have the tools to work in whatever career you want. You don't want to go too far ahead and plan too far out. But I would say that at this stage, learning about these things and just being aware of what is a mortgage, what is an auto loan, those kinds of things are very, very important.
That's an excellent insight. Thank you so much again, Mr. Boutros, for taking the time to share your experiences and incredible insights with us today. It's been a pleasure having a conversation with you.
Sure, it's been my pleasure to meet both of you. And I'm really, really encouraged by the fact that as high school students, you guys care enough to be out here performing these interviews. And I'm encouraging everyone who's watching this to really dig in. Please feel free to send me an email. I can't promise I'll be able to respond quickly, but I will respond and I'll try my best to point you in the right direction. So thanks again for having me on.